In 1989, country legend Vern Gosdin stood on stage at the Grand Ole Opry, his rich baritone earning him thunderous applause and the nickname The Voice. But just months later, the man who gave us timeless hits like Chiseled in Stone was signing bankruptcy papers, losing his home and watching his record label collapse around him. How could someone at the peak of their career lose everything overnight? The truth about Vern Gosdin's devastating fall from grace has been whispered about for decades. But today, I'm going to reveal what really happened to the man they called The Voice and the heartbreaking personal tragedy that set it all in motion. The year 1983 should have been a time of celebration for Vern Gosdin. After years of struggle, he had finally secured a solid foothold in Nashville. His singles were climbing the charts, and at 49 years old, he was proving that authentic country music still had a place in an increasingly pop-influenced landscape. But fate had other plans that would shake Vern to his core. On May 23, 1983, Vern received the news that would devastate him. His brother Rex Gosdin had died suddenly of a heart attack at just 45 years old. This wasn't just the loss of a sibling, it was the loss of his original musical partner, his confidant, and one of the few people who had been with him from the very beginning of his journey. The Gosdin brothers had shared everything, from those early days singing gospel in Alabama churches to their time in California as the Gosdin brothers. Rex had been there during Vern's darkest days, when he had walked away from music entirely, and had cheered the loudest when Vern finally found success in Nashville. Friends describe a man utterly broken by grief. It was like watching someone lose their anchor in a storm, recalled one Nashville songwriter who worked with Gosdin. Vern had always been this stoic, composed figure. Suddenly he seemed lost. What many people don't realize is how deeply this loss affected Vern's decision-making. In interviews given years later, Vern would admit that after Rex's death, he developed a now or never mentality. "I started thinking that life was shorter than I'd imagined," he told a reporter in 1990. "I wanted to accomplish everything right away, because tomorrow wasn't guaranteed." This shift in mindset led Vern to make a series of increasingly risky business decisions. By 1984, just a year after Rex's death, Vern had begun laying the groundwork for what he hoped would be his empire. He established his own record label, Complete Records, and began investing heavily in studio equipment and real estate. But there was a crucial difference between Vern and other artists who successfully made this transition. Vern was a singer and songwriter, not a businessman. The complex world of music distribution, marketing, and finance was foreign to him. Yet in his grief-fueled determination, he convinced himself he could master it all. As Vern poured his heart into his music and his money into his business ventures, something remarkable and tragic was happening simultaneously. The very pain that was clouding his business judgment was fueling some of the most powerful music of his career. And as we're about to see, the years following Rex's death would bring Vern Gosdin to the absolute pinnacle of country music success, even as they set the stage for a financial collapse that would eventually cost him everything. While Vern Gosdin's personal grief and business ambitions were pulling him in dangerous directions behind the scenes, to the outside world, he appeared to be at the absolute height of his powers. The period from 1984 to 1989 would become known as Vern's Golden Era, a time when The Voice delivered some of the most emotionally powerful country music ever recorded. In 1984, Vern signed with Columbia Records while still maintaining his own Complete Records label for certain projects, a dual arrangement that seemed to offer the best of both worlds. With Columbia's marketing muscle behind him, Vern's singles began climbing higher on the charts than ever before. Songs like I Can Tell by the Way You Dance gave him his first #1 hit before, proving that at 50 years old, Vern Gosdin was just hitting his stride. But it was Vern's ability to convey heartbreak that truly set him apart. As music historian Robert K. Ehrman noted, Vern Gosdin communicated pain and longing better than perhaps any singer since George Jones. This talent reached its apex with the 1988 release of Chiseled in Stone, a devastating ballad about irretrievable loss that resonated with listeners on a profound level. Co-written by Gosdin and Max D. Barnes, Chiseled in Stone tells the story of an older man counseling a younger one about the permanence of certain kinds of loss. The chorus delivers one of country music's most poignant messages. You don't know about sadness till you face life alone. You don't know about lonely till it's chiseled in stone. The song won the Country Music Association's Song of the Year award in 1989 and earned Gosdin his only Grammy nomination. Other hits followed in quick succession: Set 'Em Up Joe, I'm Still Crazy, Right in the Wrong Direction, and That Just About Does It all reached the top 10 between 1908 and 1980. Vern was suddenly everywhere, on radio, on television, and on major tours. What makes this period even more remarkable is that Vern was channeling his real-life pain into his music. The loss of his brother, the strain of his business ventures, and the collapse of his fourth marriage all provided emotional fuel for his performances. When Vern sang about heartbreak, listeners didn't just hear it, they felt it in their bones. By all outward appearances, Vern Gosdin had finally arrived. After decades of struggle, false starts, and detours, the Voice was being recognized as one of country music's most important artists. He had the respect of his peers, the adoration of fans, and a string of hits that seemed likely to continue. But beneath this glittering success, the financial foundation was crumbling. Vern's Complete Records was hemorrhaging money due to mismanagement and Vern's lack of business experience. The real estate investments he had made were leveraged to the hilt, leaving him vulnerable to any market downturn. And perhaps most dangerously, Vern himself was living as though the good times would never end. As 1989 drew to a close, Vern Gosdin stood at a precipice, though he didn't know it yet. On one side was the continued acclaim for his artistic achievements. On the other side loomed financial disaster, waiting silently like a predator for the perfect moment to strike. And when it did, the fall would be swift, complete, and devastating in ways that would shock even those who thought they knew the full story of Vern Gosdin. The first signs of trouble came in early 1990. While Vern's singles continued to perform well on the charts, whispers began circulating through Nashville about delayed payments from Complete Records. Session musicians, producers, and even some of Vern's own band members reported checks being late or bouncing altogether. At first, these issues were dismissed as typical music business growing pains, cash flow problems that would resolve once the next hit record started generating revenue. But by spring of that year, the situation had deteriorated beyond simple cash flow concerns. Court documents later revealed that Vern's business empire had been built on a foundation of loans that were coming due all at once. The real estate investments he had made, primarily commercial properties in Nashville and Atlanta, were heavily mortgaged and not generating the expected returns. The recording studio he had built, state-of-the-art at the time, was operating at a loss as the technology rapidly evolved and cheaper alternatives emerged. In April 1990, the first lawsuit was filed against Gosdin and Complete Records by a group of investors who claimed they had been misled about the company's financial health. This opened the floodgates. Within weeks, creditors were lining up to collect, and the full extent of Vern's financial mismanagement became painfully clear. Former Complete Records employee Martha Stevens later told Country Weekly magazine, "It wasn't that Vern was trying to deceive anyone. He truly believed everything would work out. He kept saying, the next record will fix it all. But there comes a point where optimism crosses into delusion, and Vern had crossed that line years earlier." By summer 1990, Vern Gosdin, the man whose voice had moved millions and whose songs had topped the charts just months earlier, filed for bankruptcy. The filing revealed debts exceeding $1.5 million with assets that had been dramatically overvalued. The house in Hendersonville, Tennessee, where he had hosted legendary parties attended by the biggest names in country music, was foreclosed upon. His cars, his boats, his investments, all gone. Perhaps most devastating for Vern personally was losing control of Complete Records, and with it, the masters to many of his recordings. The very thing he had sought to avoid by starting his own label, being at the mercy of others who controlled his music, had come to pass in the worst possible way. The bankruptcy filing made headlines across the country, music world. Here was one of the genre's most respected voices, a man who had just won major awards and accolades, declaring himself financially ruined. For many in Nashville, it served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of artists trying to handle business matters without proper expertise. But the financial collapse was only part of the story. The emotional toll on Vern was immense. Friends described him as shell-shocked, unable to comprehend how things had unraveled so completely. The man who had poured his grief over his brother's death into building a business empire now faced a new kind of grief, mourning the loss of everything he had worked for. In a rare interview given to the Tennessean newspaper in late 1990, Vern spoke briefly about his situation. "I never saw it coming. One day you're on top of the world, the next day you're wondering how you'll pay for groceries. But I still have my voice. They can't take that away from me." That voice, the instrument that had earned him his nickname and his place in country music history, would indeed be his salvation. But before Vern could begin rebuilding his career, he would face yet another challenge, an industry that was rapidly changing, moving away from the traditional country sound that had been his bread and butter. As the 1990s dawned, a new generation of country artists was emerging, and the Nashville sound was evolving in ways that would make Vern Gosdin's style of heartbreak country increasingly difficult to market. The man who had lost everything would now have to find his place in a musical landscape that barely resembled the one he had conquered just a few short years before. And as we'll see in the next section, this industry shift would present challenges that even The Voice would struggle to overcome. As Vern Gosdin struggled to rebuild his life and career in the aftermath of bankruptcy, the country music industry was undergoing a seismic shift that would make his comeback even more challenging. The early 1990s marked the beginning of what many would call the Hat Act era, a time when younger, more commercially accessible artists like Garth Brooks, Clint Black, and Alan Jackson were revolutionizing the genre. This new wave of country music brought unprecedented commercial success. Garth Brooks was selling out arenas and moving albums at a pace that rivaled pop and rock stars. Country radio, once a relatively small format, was expanding into major markets across America. But this mainstream breakthrough came with a price. The traditional sounds that had defined country music for generations were increasingly pushed to the margins. For artists like Vern Gosdin, who embodied the pure honky-tonk tradition of country music, this shift was particularly devastating. Radio programmers began favoring younger artists with crossover potential. The rich, lived-in baritone that had made Vern the voice was suddenly considered too traditional, too country for country radio, an irony not lost on the veteran singers who found themselves on the outside looking in. Vern wasn't alone in this struggle. Fellow traditionalists like Gene Watson, John Anderson, and even the legendary George Jones saw their radio airplay diminish dramatically during this period. As music journalist Craig Havighurst noted, the early 90s created a bizarre situation where some of the most authentic country artists couldn't get played on country radio. The numbers tell the story. In 1989, Vern had placed 5 singles in the country top 20. By 1991, he couldn't crack the top 40. This wasn't because his voice had diminished or his songs had declined in quality. It was simply that the industry had moved on, chasing younger demographics and crossover success. In a particularly telling moment, Vern attended the 1991 Country Music Association Awards, an event where he had been celebrated just 2 years earlier for Chiseled in Stone. According to those who were there, he was barely recognized by the new generation of industry executives who were now running the show. One attendee recalled overhearing a young radio programmer ask, "Vern who?" when his name was mentioned. This industry shift compounded Vern's financial problems. Without radio airplay, concert bookings became more difficult to secure. The large venues he had played during his peak years were now booking the new stars, leaving veterans like Gosdin to play smaller clubs and county fairs, venues that paid a fraction of what he had once commanded. For a man still reeling from bankruptcy and the loss of his business, this reduction in earning potential couldn't have come at a worse time. Vern needed to rebuild his finances, but the industry he had dedicated his life to was no longer making space for artists like him. The parallels between Vern's situation and that of Gene Watson are particularly striking. Both men possessed extraordinary voices, both had enjoyed commercial success in the 1980s, and both found themselves increasingly marginalized in the 1990s. Watson would later describe this period as like watching your whole world disappear overnight. But while this industry shift was painful for Vern and his contemporaries, it also revealed something important about their artistry. Unlike some of the more commercially calculated acts of the era, Vern Gosdin had never chased trends. His music was rooted in authentic experience and genuine emotion, qualities that might fall out of commercial favor, but never lose their artistic value. As traditional country found itself pushed to the margins, a dedicated core of fans remained loyal to artists like Vern. These weren't casual listeners who followed whatever was popular. They were true believers who understood the depth and authenticity of traditional country music. And it would be these fans, along with a network of friends and fellow artists who respected his immense talent, who would help Vern begin the next chapter of his story, a comeback that would be modest in commercial terms, but rich in artistic integrity. By 1992, Vern Gosdin had every reason to walk away from music entirely. He had lost his fortune, his home, and his place on the radio. At 58 years old, in an industry increasingly dominated by younger artists, the odds of a meaningful comeback seemed slim. But Vern's resilience would prove stronger than his setbacks. The road back began with a phone call from George Jones, who invited Gosdin to join him on tour. This gesture wasn't just a professional courtesy, it was a lifeline. "George saved me when I was at my lowest," Vern later acknowledged. "He reminded me that I was still the voice, no matter what had happened with the business side of things." By 1990, Vern had secured a new recording contract with the independent label American Harvest. His albums didn't receive much radio airplay, but they sold respectably to his dedicated fan base. Other artists also stepped up. Emmylou Harris invited him to appear on her 1995 album Wrecking Ball, while Vince Gill frequently cited Gosdin as an influence in interviews. What's remarkable about Vern's comeback wasn't its commercial scale, but its artistic integrity. Unlike some veterans who attempted to update their sound to match current trends, Vern doubled down on what he did best, singing heart-wrenching country songs with unmatched emotional authenticity. "I've been to the top and I've been to the bottom," Vern reflected in a rare interview. "I've made millions and I've lost millions, but I never lost my voice, and I never lost the love for the music. As long as I can stand up there and sing, I'm a rich man." As the 1990s gave way to the 2000s, a new generation of artists and fans began rediscovering traditional country sounds. And as they explored the genre's rich history, many found their way to Vern Gosdin, a singer whose voice and songs stood as a testament to country music's emotional power and authenticity. When Vern Gosdin passed away on April 28, 2009, at the age of 74, the country music world lost more than just a legendary voice. It lost a living link to the genre's most authentic traditions. The funeral service drew a who's who of country music royalty, with George Jones delivering a moving eulogy and Vince Gill performing Chiseled in Stone. Perhaps most telling were the tributes from a younger generation of artists. Singers like Jamie Johnson, Chris Stapleton, and Ashley Monroe, standard-bearers for traditional country in the modern era, all cite Gosdin as a profound influence. "When I first heard Vern sing Chiseled in Stone," Johnson once said, "I realized that was what country music was supposed to sound like." Vern's approach to songwriting, direct, emotionally honest, and rooted in real-life experience, has become a template for artists seeking to create authentic country music in an increasingly commercialized landscape. In the years since his passing, streaming platforms have introduced his music to new listeners who might never have encountered it on radio. What remains most powerful about Vern Gosdin's story is the contrast between his business failures and his artistic triumphs. The very qualities that made him vulnerable in the music business, his emotional sensitivity and unwillingness to compromise, were the same qualities that made his music enduring. The man they called the Voice may have lost everything financially, but in artistic legacy and impact, Vern Gosdin remains immeasurably rich. For those who seek music that speaks to the deepest human experiences, his songs continue to offer something no amount of money could buy: the truth, chiseled in stone.